Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you are safe, sound, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome again to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm truly pleased and honored to welcome to the program two extraordinary educators and scholars. Let me introduce them. And by the way, these abbreviated bios don't do either of them the justice that they deserve. Dr. Amaney Jamal is the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and Edwards S. Sanford Professor of Politics and Professor in International Affairs at Princeton. She's the former director of the Mamdouh S. Bob Center for Peace and Studies. Dr. Jamal directs the workshop on Arab political development and the Bob Center American University of Beirut Collaborative Initiative. She's also the co-founder and co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer Project. And in 2006, she was named a Carnegie Scholar. She holds a PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Go Blue, and her book, Barriers to Democracy, 2007, which explores the role of civic associations in promoting democratic effects in the Arab world, won the 2008 American Political Science Best Book Award in the Comparative Democratization section. Dr. Keren Yarhi-Milo is the Dean of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. She's a world-renowned expert in international security and crisis decision-making. She joined the tenured faculty at Columbia in 2019 after a decade at Princeton. She's the author of two award-winning books, Who Fights for Reputation, The Psychology of Leaders in International Conflict, and Knowing the Adversary, Leaders, Intelligence Organizations, and Assessments of Intentions in International Relations. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, BA from Columbia. She grew up in Israel, served in the IDF intelligence, and now lives in New York City with her husband and her two sons. Amaney and Keren, if I may, let me welcome you, both of you, to Carnegie Connects. Look, I can think of no two better humans on the planet to have this conversation. I mean, you are heads of the two of the most prestigious public policy schools in the country at two of the most prestigious universities in the country. One of you is a Palestinian American, the other is an Israeli American, and above all, you have a quite remarkable and extraordinary relationship with one another. I would presume to assume that you are actually fast friends. I spent most of my 27 years at the Department of State in the middle of difficult conversations between Israelis and Palestinians and their supporters. And I learned a couple of things. Number one, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a morality play, which pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness and evil on the other. It's a complicated conflict in which both sides have mutual needs and requirements. It may, in fact, be Goethe's definition of a tragedy, two competing justices. I've also learned that leadership is critically important and will be critically important at all levels in how this conflict and whether or not this conflict can be resolved. And the two of you, frankly, are leaders in this result. You know how to talk to one another, not just to practice civility, which is so much more than just listening politely, but to do so with a kind of empathy and strong desire to build bridges, not walls. So it's in this spirit that I want to begin and conduct this conversation. All life begins with the personal. So let me ask the two of you, how did this relationship begin? And what have you learned about the other that has helped you in having difficult conversations? Amaney, let me begin with you.
Thank you, Aaron, for that very kind and generous introduction. And I want to just take a moment to thank you for all the great work you've done to try to sort of move this process forward for two sides to find two states and live side by side. Keren, thank you for joining me. It's always an honor. So I'll start out by saying, Aaron, Keren and I were colleagues. We started off as colleagues here at Princeton. I believe when Keren joined, she came in as she came as an assistant professor. I was coming up for tenure, So for a while, we joined the camaraderie and solidarity of being assistant professors at Princeton, and we could talk to each other and support one another. So there was a lot there that brought us together. But I think what also brought us together, Aaron, is that knowing that she was an Israeli and I was Palestinian, and that we were both committed to the peace process. And at the time, the peace process wasn't really going at great momentum, but this was in like still the early 2000s, moving into the late 2000s. There was still at least some hope that there would be peace. And we both saw each other on the same side of the token. So we would always talk to one another and sort of summarize what was happening on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, I'd always ask Keren about her input and analysis. So we were sort of committed to the project of a two-state solution that would bring peace, security, recognition to two peoples. And you mentioned leadership, Aaron, right? So, now we don't see anybody having those conversations, but because at the time, people like yourself and the administration, the world was still, even on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side, the world was committed to a two-state solution. People were working on it. There was a place and space to talk about reconciliation and peace. Today, as we will be discussing later on in the show, because the peace process is no longer part of a mainstream public debate in any of our societies, it's almost impossible then to sort of have those conversations on our campuses. So again, when we think about global leadership, when the tide is a tide of separation and hate, it makes our jobs as administrators that much more difficult.
Yeah. And to you, Keren.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So Amaney has been an amazing mentor to me, and I'm so grateful, not for the mentorship, for the friendship. I always learn so much of her. She's a tremendous, brilliant scholar of the Middle East. And it's exactly right. I mean, it's the backgrounds, it's what the generation that both of us grew up on this Oslo, the peace process, and the idea that there's no military solution to this conflict. Nobody's going anywhere. We need to really think about what the political solution is. And then on top of that, you add the layer of both of us are political scientists, we're all about evidence, data-driven, and finding, wrestling with puzzles and how we find a solution to the puzzle. And I think, that's really what brings us together again and again. Like, how do we find a path forward? And it's really remarkable that we both found ourselves as deans of these policy schools, as you said, at that moment of October 7th, where she and I, a couple of months before, were talking about things that we should do together, because we noticed that for a long time, we haven't been talking about the peace process and what's the future of this. And then October 7 hit. And when that happened, we realized, yes, we're going to see, it's a huge crisis that we're going to be seeing on campuses and definitely in the Middle East. But we have a special role to play because we are from the region, because we have expertise, and because we now have a platform. And so that was was the reason why we wrote the op-ed in the New York Times and did this early on in the fall.
It's fascinating. You learn from one another? Is it true, Amaney, that when you need additional information or want another perspective on Israel, you'll turn to Keren, and Keren as well, with respect to the complexity of Palestinian politics, you'll turn to Amaney? Is it that sort of analytical exchange of information in which you both can develop and learn from one another?
100%, Aaron. Keren also is an amazing scholar, a very accomplished scholar of also sort of psychology of leadership. So when I'm trying to figure out what's happening on the Israeli side, like, she's like one of the most known experts on the subject matter. So I will call her. But before I call her to ask her about her analysis, we're also friends. So we will say, like, how is your family? How are your loved ones? What is going on in Israel? Again, I'm very sorry that what's going on. And she will say the same. How is your mother? How are people? Do you have family and relatives in Gaza? So the foundation of our friendship is not simply one about, with all due respect, Aaron, quid pro quo political science analysis. We can always get that elsewhere. Fundamentally, we care about each other and our families, and we understand and comprehend that we've been dragged into this conflict almost without our choice, right? We were born into this conflict. As you're born Israeli or Palestinian, you inherit this conflict. If we could have it our way, this conflict would have been resolved a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Keren?
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, it starts with the friendship, and I think that it's about our families in Israel. It's about how we're, I throughout this process, I mean, we've been in touch. Like, how are you dealing with things where you are? Can I be of any help? Is there anything that, right? And she would do the same with me. And I learned so much from her leadership and how she leads with talking to faculty, talking to students. When she came to Columbia, I looked, I really observed how, she interacts, and I learned from her as a friend, as a scholar, as that's just as a leader. I mean, that's like been, very unique. I mean, I have lots of colleagues, but we are both now at a place and a position that makes this even more special and more unique and meaningful, I would say.
Before we move on to the campus and the Israel-Hamas war, I want to ask you each a question. With respect to, first to Amaney, what is it, do you think, Amaney, that the media and the way this conflict is being perceived that we're not getting with respect to Palestinians? What is it we least understand and perhaps is most important to understand?
So I think at the heart of it, Aaron, when I see the media, when I listen to students who are complaining about the media, is the fact that Palestinians are still reduced to sort of these subhumane sort of qualities. And anybody who says, I'm devastated about what's happening in Gaza is automatically assumed to be a Hamas supporter. So, again, sort of denigrating the humanity of the suffering, the incredible suffering that's happening in Gaza, and then adding insult to injury to say, well, if you want to humanize that experience, you must be supporting terrorists. So it's sort of compounded. And this is where a lot of the rage and sort of outrage and sort of people's emotions are all over the place about this, because oftentimes what Palestinian or Palestinian supporters want to hear is that these are humans. They too got caught up in this conflict. They didn't, on October 7th, launch this horrendous event at Israel. And we as a world, we need to be outraged about the suffering of these innocent civilians in Gaza. And when that humanization and that empathy is not happening, Aaron, it creates the ingredients of a very toxic environment.
Absolutely.
And Keren, what is it about the way the conflict and Israel is presented that you think we don't understand?
First of all, there's a lot in this, what we've seen since October 7 that really puzzled me. First of all, how quickly the complexity of the conflict, the context, all of this was just completely ignored. Everything kind of boiled down very quickly to simple slogans. And this dichotomy and this kind of polarization that each camp cannot really see anything, or look at evidence that maybe challenges some of the assumptions, or really wrestle with the complexity of the conflict. And I understand, as somebody who studies psychology of decision making and psychology, I understand, you want to limit cognitive dissonance, you have premature cognitive closure, and from that moment on, you're close to information that contradicts what you already think, and you can't even allow for self-criticism. And so, just if I support if I am, support Israel, it doesn't mean that I support genocide, or that doesn't mean that I support all the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's the same thing if you're a pro-Palestinian person. So I think that is a big thing that we are seeing, and it's part of a larger trend of polarization and reducing the complexity to something that is so simple. But I think the other thing that is really alarming to me, that is different in what we've seen in terms of the reaction here, is that usually, and I've been at Columbia for a long time, I was a student there in 2000. Usually when you talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict, it was in the context of 1967. It's the idea that you want to end the occupation, the idea that you want to go back to the pre-67 borders, withdraw from Gaza, withdraw from the West Bank, have a Palestinian state, and the idea was end the occupation. What you've learned, what we've seen now is a more of a narrative of, it's no longer about 67, it's about 48 not everybody, and we can talk about it, but the idea of the entire concept of a Jewish state, of the state of Israel, that's now what you're hearing from many. That is, and what are the implications of a one-state solution? That's not something that we have really seen. I have not seen this to that extent before the last year. And I guess it goes back to what Amaney was saying, is that for a long time, we haven't had a peace process. We haven't had those conversations. Nobody made the case for a two-state solution. Our students are not even, many of them don't even know about the Oslo process. And so that makes the blurring of this one state, two state that's not what you don't see the students kind of understanding necessarily what are the implications of some of the chants or some of the things that they proclaim.
I'll have to have both of you back to talk about end games, end states with respect to the conflict itself. But let's turn now to the campus. Not since Vietnam has any foreign policy issue, in my experience, roiled as many campuses as the Israel-Hamas war. I think there is a certain perspective. It was an Axios poll that came out in May. They polled 1,250 college and university students to find that only 8% of those polled had participated on one side or the other in the protest, and that the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Israel-Gaza war, ranked way down the list in terms of what was important to those who were polled. So we are dealing with a minority, but that minority has created quite a extraordinary demonstration on campuses. And I guess I'd ask the question, why? We were in Iraq for 20 years. Americans were deployed, they were fighting, they were dying. Thousands of Americans were killed and wounded. U.S. forces killed thousands of civilians, Afghans and Iraqis. And yet you didn't see the intensity, the duration of what has occurred on campus in response to the Israel-Hamas war. So first you, Amaney, I would just ask the question, why? What's happened? How did this erupt the way it's evolved?
So I think it's a variety of factors, Aaron. You really can't put it on any one factor. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still always will elicit very emotional reactions. It's an emotional topic, right? It's a topic that, let's just be honest about it, Aaron, we grow up, Keren can say this, you probably know this. When you talk about Israel-Palestine, you have to be alert. You want to make sure that you're threading that needle carefully to sort of make sure you're bringing people along in the conversation, right? So, how do I say that? Like, if I'm a supporter of two-state solutions, kind of going back to Keren, right? We sort of saw after October 7th where the youth public sentiment is, but for the last 2 or 3 years, when we were trying to do events on campus on the two-state solution, Aaron, I would always get a ton of emails saying, you're so retro, you're so basically caught in the past, the two-state solution is dead, it's only a one-state solution until you get on the bandwagon, we're not going to come to your events, right? So there was this, like, the two-state solution. There was this opinion that the two-state solution is dead, especially when you look at the expansion of settlements on the West Bank. So we were already struggling to have a conversation around the two-state solution, given realities on the ground, and given, as Keren said, the world wasn't paying attention to this conflict at all. So there is this sort of emotional commitment to this topic. I also think that this is a different political moment in the US than when we were in Iraq. Remember, after Iraq, there was still the shock of 9/11. That whole generation was a little bit silenced. Since then, more recently with COVID and the pandemic and the onset of social media and the George Floyd protests, like, there is this idea that the youth should be mobilizing to express their opinions. So I think it's a little bit of a different sort of political moment in our own history. And so why on college campuses? That's where the youth galvanize. That's where they are. By and large, we have to have the conversation about, what is the responsibility of universities in these moments of crisis, any crisis, right? I've had students come in and say, Princeton can't be supporting genocide. What are you doing about it? And it's like, well, can you please explain to us, like, what do you mean by that, right? Or what are you going to do to stop the conflict? And I understand that it sounds a little bit surreal, but it's these students believing that we are powerful players and that we can actually talk to people who have influence on the conflict, right? So I have to keep reminding myself, Aaron, that these youth are all between the ages of 18 and 21. This is probably one of the first sort of main political issues that they're caring about. And sometimes they're very informed and sometimes they're still learning. And so let's take this as a learning opportunity as well. So in the chaos of trying to sort of figure out where these protests are and what they're asking, let's just also try to educate and make sure that every student feels that their voice is being heard, but more importantly, that every student feels safe on our campuses. That's sort of the goal of the university.
Yeah, how to create that safe space when emotions are running so high is critically important to having functional conversations. I agree. Keren, to you, why the intensity and duration of these protests?
So I totally agree with Amaney, and I add to this social media and how they consume information and the whole the way that many people these days, how they socialize to engage with information through this kind of more echo chamber and feeling that they're only safe when they are around people that they agree with, that they share their ideas, and the idea that having, being in a dialogue is much harder with people you disagree with, is much harder cognitively, emotionally, than being around people that agree with you, or than monologuing. And protest is a lot about monologue. It's not about dialogue. And I think that but I have to say about the protests specifically, they're not a monolith. It's not just, if you really look at the range of students who've been engaging in protests on campuses, I would say that they're motivated by different things. They're not all of the same. For the most part, a lot of them reacted to the horrific scenes that they saw coming out of Gaza. And that, for many of them, what they wanted is a ceasefire. And they thought that maybe the university is a place that's where the best place in their mind that they could really expect a change. I mean, as Amaney said, we're not controlling the government of Israel's actions, but this is where they were. And they reacted to that and wanted a ceasefire. Then there were those who were, it was more than a ceasefire. It was part of a political campaign that started even before October 7 about BDS, about divestment, and about boycott. And that led to and prolonged some of it, right? And you see some of the demands is not for a ceasefire, it's a demand to support BDS or to boycott Israel, and for university to do that. So that's a group that has a very clear political agenda. That's not new, but it's definitely gained momentum. And then there are the third group that cares a lot about what's happening in Israel. And the idea is, like Amaney said, that, should be a one state. We shouldn't be talking about it two states. Or so we see a variety, and the motivation is different. And I cannot tell you how many are in each group, but I can say that in all of this, I think that we've seen the protest. Some people said, "Oh, those kids don't know what they're talking about." I don't think this is true. I think, yes, there are going to be some people who don't know which river and which sea, but I have a lot of very knowledgeable students who know quite a bit about the region, and they, and they are there, protesting too. Now, we can think about, I don't think this is over. I think actually in the fall, we're going to see continuation, and it's going to morph into, as with the election and everything. But as Amaney said, we have to find a space to have those conversations where we challenge each other.
Yeah. Mark Rudd, no stranger to protests at Columbia, who figured so prominently in 1968 in the Columbia protest against the war in Vietnam, gave an interview to the Israeli paper Haaretz. Yeah. And he had two main takeaways. Number one, he thought quite simply that most of the outrage on campus was as a consequence of the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths as a consequence of Israel's efforts to prosecute its war against Hamas and the humanitarian catastrophe that emerged in its wake. But he also noted that he found it striking that so many of the protesters were unable to hold and relate to the pain, suffering, and trauma that the Israelis experience. So, and I find this to be perhaps one of the most depressing pieces of this. Why is it so hard to hold in your head and in your heart the sufferings, traumas, pain, and the narratives of both Israelis and Palestinians simultaneously? Is it too much to ask students in their late teens and early 20s to have that sort of emotional intelligence? Does it have to be, we have to choose sides rather than understanding the needs and requirements and pain of each side? And if you can't come to these realizations at a university campus, when will you get an opportunity to experience and understand both sides? Why is it so hard for your students, or many of your students, or maybe some of them? Amaney?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Aaron, and I have a lot of respect for Mark Rudd, but I want to respond with 3 points. So the first point is a story after October 7th, right the day after October 7th. Like, my mom lives on the West Bank in Ramallah, and I called my mom and I said, "Did you see what happened?" She's like, "Yeah, I'm watching the TV. I can't move." And then she started crying. I said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "Because the granddaughter of one of the Israeli hostages, the Israeli hostage female, is like 70 plus years, and the granddaughter's on TV. This is broadcasting in Ramallah, and the granddaughter's crying, saying, 'My grandmother needs her medicines. At least, how can we get the medicine to my grandma who's now a hostage in Gaza?'" And my mom is telling me that I see this as me becoming a hostage, and your daughters are crying. Her granddaughters are crying for her. So complete empathy, complete, like, I could have been this person and your daughters could be on TV crying, and my mom is in tears. And so we fast forward and we see these protests on our campuses, Aaron, and there's no empathy. But the truth is, I want to say, like, I totally agree with Mark that when we were approaching pro-Palestinian protests, and often the pro-Palestinian protesters are seen as only Palestinian or Arab or Muslim. I mean, the vast majority of protesters on our campus were progressive Jews, right?
Yeah.
But they were so angry with everything that they didn't want to hear anything about the pain and suffering on the Israeli side, not because they don't believe Israelis are worthy and of humanity. But their whole point is nobody humanizes the Palestinian side. This is the point. They don't. Why is it that they have to humanize the Israelis all the time, but nobody spends time, or even Mark Rudd didn't write about, well, maybe the Palestinians need to be humanized. Like, the Lancet just came out and said, after all that's said and done, if we get a ceasefire now, after all that's said and done, approximately 186,000 Palestinians, including those under the rubble, will have been killed. That's almost the 8% of the population of Gaza. That's just tremendous. Yes. And so that is not being humanized, is creating this moral outrage for our students. Having said that, what happened to Israel, I want to make sure that we know, this is mind-boggling, what's happening in Gaza, but it doesn't negate and shouldn't come at the expense of being able to say, Aaron and Keren, what happened to Israelis on October 7th was horrifying. Yeah. And like I said, I had to console my mom on the phone, who kept seeing herself and my daughters as the grandmother and the granddaughters, and she's Palestinian. So I've always felt, Aaron and Keren, and you guys know this, I've said this to you, that diaspora politics is a little bit more polarized on this topic than actual politics on the ground in Palestine, Israel, right?
Yeah, that's what I always say.
We can talk to each other a little bit more, but the truth is this need of humanization, it has to be a goal of humanizing both sides. And it has to be more than just saying we condemn anti-Semitism and we condemn Islamophobia, because that's just, like, in my opinion, not sincere. We have to sit with these communities and really talk to them eye to eye, human to human, and make sure that they feel heard and they are safe.
Keren?
I cannot agree more with Amaney. I would add that it's mind-boggling also what you're describing. Even if you look at what's happening on campuses and how people are sometimes refusing to really deal with reality. And I give you and it's on both sides, right? I mean, the idea that some people would say, oh, there's no anti-Semitism on campus and campuses, or whatever we see, it's not our students. Oh yeah, well, it is our students, but it's not a lot. But well, it exists, and it also exists. Also, we see Islamophobia on campuses and anti-Palestinian sentiments, and they are also real, and people refuse to acknowledge that. I think that creates dissonance. It creates, the cognitive closure that many people want to have when they're attached to a position or to a team, is that, all good things go with that, and no bad, you can't have anything bad that is associated with the side that you choose to. It's oversimplification of reality. And so the idea that what our role is to insert a bit of complexity into the narrative, a bit of pushing and challenging some things, so to allow for actual not just conversation, but analysis that is critical analysis, that is really analytical, as opposed to all emotional. Because if you're going just with the emotions, you're just not you're not going to get to a point where you're really wrestling with the issues. And this is also the role, I would say, it's not just the role of universities to do that, but specifically, I would say, a special role for policy schools within universities. Yeah. Because that's where we can really shine and lead, especially at this moment. This is what policy schools should know and know how to do. And that's what I hope that, we've seen some of it already, but next year will be even a bigger opportunity to show the case and to make the case for the role of policy schools.
I do want to move on to the issue of whether I don't want to challenge the notion that universities can't provide safe space for this. Mm-hmm. Although it's not Ann Arbor during the 70s or late 60s where they were tough conversations, but nothing like we witness now. But I wanted to ask you, since both of you have raised anti-Semitism and hostility and animosity towards Arabs and Muslims, how big of a problem is anti-Semitism? And hostility and animosity toward Arabs and Muslims on campus. I mean, Keren, you know that 3 deans were removed as a consequence of tweets. There are a couple lawsuits, the New York Times reported, NYU and Columbia. How big of a problem do you think anti-Semitism is on campus?
I think it is.
For that matter, the hostility towards Arabs and Muslims.
Yeah,
Huge problems throughout the United States.
Huge.
Clear
Huge
rises in both. But what about on the university campus?
It's a big problem. It's a very serious problem. It's a big problem. I've personally never really wanted to, never acknowledged this before, never felt it personally up until October 7th. But after that, I have to say the things that I've personally experienced, and not talking about what I've seen and talked to my students, it is a real issue. And I think maybe one of the silver lining of all of this, and I hate to say this, is that there is a realization now more than ever that this is a real problem on universities, campuses, and we have to deal with it. And universities like ours, like many, we can't change overnight, but it revealed a lot of weaknesses in how we are training students, how we are educating what we've done right, what we have not done right. But it's true with anti-Semitism, with anti-Arab hate. But again, I can say that not everybody will agree on the extent to which this is a problem. But I think that not a lot of people who've seen the data and looked at the footage can really say that it's not a problem that exists on campuses. So now the question is, how do we deal with this?
Yeah.
And it's true. How do we deal with this with our students, with our faculty? How do we deal with this in a responsible way that doesn't create a backlash? So there's no backlash against and some of the stuff like, thinking about free speech and protections of minorities and anti-discrimination. These are things that we are wrestling with in a very serious way for since October 7th, in a different way than before. So that's going to take time and it has taken time for universities to figure out how to deal with this. But I really hope that we're at a point where we have a plan, and that we'll see this. Universities will have better plans of how to educate on those issues, and how to get the students to have better capacity to handle, for the university to have better capacity to deal with incidents and complaints and so on in an efficient way, because otherwise we're not going to be the place that students will come to really learn and engage. And
Amaney?
No, I agree with Keren. I think there's a rise of anti-Semitism and there's a rise of Islamophobia. I mean, traditionally, Aaron and Keren, and I've said this before, is that when we've looked at studies about studies on bigotry and who's more likely to be anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, it's typically the same people who are anti-Semitic are also going to be Islamophobic and vice versa. It was like from the mainstream towards minorities. So like Jews and Muslims are on the same side of the token here. Having said that, with a conflict like October 7th and what's been going on, we're seeing more of the groups sort of at each other and saying things that are promoting, if you may, anti-Semitic rhetoric and Islamophobic rhetoric both ways, right? So I'm very discouraged by that. Aaron and Keren, I don't know if you agree. I mean, at least I've been in academia now for 20 years. And what I do know, though, is in moments where there is not this incredibly absurd, with all due respect, like, a conflict going at it, we are able as a community to bring people together and to recognize one another and at least sit with each other. We've hosted joint trips of Muslim and Jewish students here at Princeton before. I know for a fact that as Princeton was sort of developing its halal food offerings, a lot of Muslim students would always dine at the Center for Jewish Life because of kosher. They had a lot of great friendships there in CJL. So there were these mechanisms that brought our communities together in ways to lessen anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but it was also conditional on the political environment. And to go back where we started, when our leaders are responsible and talking responsibly, it helps communities come together. I think we, in this moment of political crisis, even in our own country, if I may, where we're completely polarized and really interesting things are being said about all sorts of groups, denigrating them, it makes our job on campuses a lot more difficult to call out anti-Semitism and Islamophobia head on. But I still think we need to do that. I still think we need to be in those spaces. We need to be able to talk to our students and assure them that their spaces will be protected. Sort of draw the line, like, yes, there's free speech, but hate speech is not tolerated. I think this has to be a universal rule on all our campuses. I know that we at Princeton have had this conversation, and we feel very strongly that this needs to be a place and space where every student feels included, respected, and validated. And this is basically our commitment. I think more universities need to come out and say that directly.
We're nearing the end of our time. The two of you penned an op-ed at the end of October. I think that it was titled, "The Discourse is Toxic, Universities Can Help." That was 6-7 months ago. Let me just ask you flat out, do you still believe that? Keren, to you.
Wholeheartedly. I think that there's no better place than universities to do this kind of work. In the classroom, outside of the classrooms, with the 18-year-olds that are coming all the way to the graduate students that in our schools respectively are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. I think that this is a crisis, and like all crisis, like Churchill said, let's not get, let's not waste this one, use this as an opportunity. But I'm not saying it's been easy. It hasn't been easy. It's very hard. It requires both, people like Amaney and myself to be very thoughtful of how we're doing this and how we're engaging with the students. We need to be there to offer the opportunity. And to offer the opportunities to engage with one another, with different voices in small groups and workshops and in different types of ways. Only universities, I think, can do this. But I am optimistic a bit, even though I do think we're going to have a fall with potentially even more protest and disruption. But I do think that ultimately more students will want to come and engage in the classrooms, in workshops. It's a skill, it's beyond, Aaron, it's beyond the Arab-Israeli conflict. These are skills that are going to be important for them to have in life, in their career. The idea that you can sit across the table from someone you really disagree with, and you don't share the same political views, and then you still have to work with this person, or that person might be your boss or might be your employee, and you need to be able to do that. That's important. It was a problem that we've seen before October 7, where students were polled and they said that they have friends from all different backgrounds and identities, but they don't have friends who have political views that are different from theirs. And this is why we started in the Institute of Global Politics the idea of across the aisle, to model the students how to have constructive dialogues between Republicans and Democrats, for example. So you see the same thing with the Arab-Israeli. Once you choose a side, it's very hard to engage. But that's what we here to do, and to have this platform and in the policy schools and universities. I think it's a great one. I'm not saying it's easy. I think that we have, and we're learning about the best practices. Yes. But I think it's crucial. So I will double down on what we wrote
The two of you said you need courage. Amaney?
I just want to echo everything Keren said. I not only believe that we're in a great position to continue having these conversations, I think we're obligated, Keren. In this moment, it's incumbent upon us and on our students to be able to engage people with different viewpoints. Look, for everybody who supports a ceasefire and everybody who protested for a ceasefire, where are the negotiators right now? They are all in Qatar. You have Israeli, American, Qatari, Egyptian, and Hamas. They're all in Qatar. Whether they're talking to each other or through intermediaries, they are talking to one another. And we're not going to get a ceasefire unless people are talking to one another. We're not going to get a two-state solution unless people are talking to one another. So if you care about this conflict, we need to be dialoguing with one another in the end of the day. University campuses shouldn't be social media algorithmic outcomes where you only are in your echo chamber. We need to make sure our algorithms on universities are bringing in a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives, educating our students so they can make their own decisions and be effective policymakers down the line. And as an effective policymaker, you need to know what the lay of the field looks like. You need to know what your choice sets look like. You need to know where support is and opposition. You need to navigate that space. If we're not able to do that, then we are failing in training the next generation of policymakers.
Yeah. Well, we're at the end of our conversation. Let me, as a tribute to the two of you, let me just close with a personal story. My last diplomatic mission was in March of 2002. Colin Powell, then Secretary of State Colin Powell, sent then Special Envoy Anthony Zinni, former head of CENTCOM, and me to try to negotiate a ceasefire between Yasser Arafat and Ariel Sharon. This was February of 2002. At the height of the Second Intifada. And we went to see Shimon Peres, the former prime minister and foreign minister. And Peres told Zinni that he would meet three kinds of people on his journey. He'd meet the self-righteous, he'd meet the collectors of arguments, and he'd meet the problem solvers. And I must say, in 45 minutes, you buoyed my spirits, however grim matters look. If we could clone the two of you and create the kind of space that the two of you have created for one another and for your students, we'd be way ahead of the game. So I want to thank you for your insights, for your brilliance, and above all, for your humanity and willingness and ability to respect and engage with one another. And perhaps maybe the two of you in your own way will help to bend the arc of history in the right direction. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And always a great pleasure, Keren and Aaron.
We'll have you back for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was an honor. Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye, Amaney. Bye, Aaron.